Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. This is a really special week on the show. I was able to reconnect with one of my good friends and colleagues. This is Ferris Jabr, who has just written an incredible book on becoming Earth. Ferris is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and author of this new book. He's also written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's, National Geographic, Scientific American, among many other publications. He is the recipient of a Whiting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Grant, as well as fellowships from MIT and UC Berkeley. His work has also been anthologized in several editions of the Best American Science and Nature Writing series. He has an MA in journalism from the New York University and Bachelor of Science from Tufts University. It's so great to have you on the show, Ferris. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I was eagerly awaiting the release of your book, and I just knew it was going to be exquisitely researched and beautifully written because that is just how you write. And I wanted to share this with our audience. Our audience is a mix of people interested in food and science. And while this book isn't necessarily about food per se, I think that it hits on a lot of themes that a lot of people, will really resonate with. So maybe we can start with just a question about what's the origin of the book? How did you come up with this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this book explores a new way of thinking about our planet, of understanding our planet, not so much the sort of classical, a planet with life on it, but rather a planet that came to life and what that really means. And for me, this book began more than 10 years ago, and it began with plants, which is
Yay.
a mutual passion of ours. And it began when I learned that the Amazon rainforest doesn't just passively receive the rain that it depends on, it actually generates at least half of that rain in a typical year. And then what really astonished me was the way that this happens. It was so much more than just trees and other plants pulling water from the soil, and releasing what they don't use to the atmosphere. It was involving really all of the life in the forest, the pollen grains, the fungal spores, the microbes, everything that was getting swept up into the air. I started to think of it as the wet breath of the forest, and how all these little, biological particles accelerate cloud formation and stimulate rain, giving the water vapor something to condense onto, and how biology is a hugely important part of the water cycle around the world. So that set me on this journey of, searching for other examples of life dramatically altering its environment, and quickly realizing this was not just an isolated phenomenon, wasn't just one or two examples. This was happening everywhere, in the oceans, in the atmosphere, on the continents. And that really, Western science had undervalued and underappreciated how much life continually shapes the planet and is responsible for many of the planet's fundamental features. The major reason we have a breathable atmosphere, a blue sky, that wildfires are possible, that we have rich, fertile soils, this all came from life or was influenced by life in some way. And that's really what I wanted to explore in this book.
Amazing. Well, and you start off, I have a passage here I underlined that I think really does a great job of opening the book. You say, the history of life on Earth is the history of life remaking Earth,
Mhm.
which is, I think that's just it's just a really fascinating way to think about our origins. And maybe you could tell us a little, some more examples about how life has changed Earth itself. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most profound transformations has to be the oxygenation of Earth, which was a
Mhm.
very long and ancient process. So, if we go back 4 billion years or so, there was basically no oxygen in the atmosphere whatsoever. And Earth probably had this hazy orange atmosphere. Um, Today, we have 21% oxygen in the atmosphere and clear blue skies on a nice day. So that is a massive transformation, chemically as well. Earth went from an oxygen poor environment to a highly oxidizing, oxygen rich environment. And the way this happened was largely through the evolution and activity of photosynthetic organisms. So
Mhm.
going back, 2.5 billion years, photosynthetic ocean microbes called cyanobacteria. They invented the kind of photosynthesis we're familiar with, the kind that takes in sunlight and carbon dioxide and puts out oxygen as a byproduct. And so by filling up the seas and the atmosphere with oxygen, they revolutionized the entire chemistry of the planet. This was a permanent shift that was later reinforced by terrestrial plants. Together, cyanobacteria, algae, and land plants raised the level of atmospheric oxygen from basically zero to 20%, and then even beyond. If we go back 300 million years to the Carboniferous, the oxygen level was probably, 30 to 35%, so significantly higher than today. Back then, we had, massive dragonflies, the size of pigeons, and millipedes, the size of surfboards, and they were just loving this oxygen-rich environment that made it easier for them to fly, to breathe through their skin. And so the level of oxygen fluctuated wildly throughout Earth's history. And it was only in the past 50 million years or so that it kind of started to stabilize more compared to Earth's deep past and stay around 21%. And some Earth scientists think that is because of the co-evolution of oxygen, photosynthetic life, and fire. And the details get a bit complicated, but the gist is that the presence and activity of photosynthetic life, especially on land, and the way it co-evolves with fire acts as a regulator on the level of atmospheric oxygen. So if you have really high oxygen levels, like you did in the Carboniferous, and you have these raging wildfires fueled by that high oxygen, that burns down immense tracts of terrestrial vegetation, and that weakens the very mechanism by which oxygen accumulates in the atmosphere. So it provides a negative or stabilizing feedback. And this is something we see again and again in the Earth system, that life and environment co-evolve, they change each other.
Mhm.
And when they're given enough time and opportunity, they converge upon these stabilizing relationships that ensure their mutual persistence. Another amazing example is how much plankton transform every aspect of the Earth system. Alfred Redfield, this oceanographer and ecologist in the 50s, discovered what's now known as the Redfield ratio. He showed that essentially the chemistry of the oceans is created and defined by the plankton in the oceans. So wherever he was sampling deep sea water, he was finding exactly the same ratio of nitrogen and phosphorus in that water as he was in the cells of plankton themselves. And it turns out that these plankton, by taking in nitrogen and phosphorus into their bodies, changing it and then putting it back out into the world, they evolve these incredibly complex ecological loops that essentially create the chemistry of the oceans and maintain it in a way that is essential for all other life. Um, and so Paul Falkowski, another oceanographer, he said plankton do not just reflect the chemistry of the oceans, they create that chemistry. This
Wow.
is something we see again and again. And then plankton are so amazing. So if plankton basically are also composing much of the bones and the architecture of our planet. So if you chip off a piece of the White Cliffs of Dover in the UK, this massive cliff formation made of chalk or
Mhm.
limestone, and you look at it under a super powerful microscope, you're not just going to see random bits of rock. You're going to see highly organized structures that almost look like the stones in a stone archway. They're packed very neatly together, and these are the remains of the shells and skeletons of ancient single-celled plankton that lived in the ocean more than 65 million years ago and sank to the bottom of the sea when they died and accumulated in sediments that turned into stone over time because they were compacted under such intense pressure. And then as sea levels change, that massive accumulation of ancient plankton gets exposed. And that's what the White Cliffs of Dover are. They're this massive fossil bed of tiny ancient plankton. And so it's just incredible to me that, giant sections of the Alps and other mountains that are made of limestone and chalk are in fact composed of ancient microorganisms, ancient microscopic beings, which means that everything we've built with chalk and limestone like the Washington Monument,
Mhm.
Notre Dame, the Colosseum, Michelangelo's David. All of these things are also secretly made of plankton as well. So yeah, these are some of the most powerful examples that I found of how life is continually shaping the planet. It's composing large parts of the planet, and it is bringing the planet as a whole to life.
That's incredible. I love how these are, things in plain sight that we don't necessarily, recognize when you see these objects and these landforms. It sounds like plankton is almost like the secret to life. I mean, when you think about extending what's happened on Earth, there's a lot of interest in space exploration, obviously, and you know, would something like a transfer of plankton help to colonize another planet? Or, I mean, what would it take? It sounds like it would take many, many years, millions or billions of years to transform other planetary bodies, but what can we learn from Earth for that?
Yeah, there's so many astrobiologists and cosmologists who are very interested in what's now known as Earth system science and the
Mhm,
coevolution of Earth and life, because it obviously has major implications for detecting and understanding life elsewhere in the universe. There's many astrobiologists who now think about planets coming to life and then dying or enduring rather than just life evolving on those planets. And so some scientists say, our sibling planets, Mars and Venus, maybe they came to life at some point. Maybe they did way in the past and then they died because of some sort of
mm,
climate change runaway catastrophe. And if we did not have life on Earth today, if Earth had not come to life, we would have an atmosphere and a sort of overall chemical condition much more similar to that of Mars or Venus, where it's just entirely dictated by physics rather than biology. So
mhm,
if it were just dictated by physics, we would not have oxygen in our atmosphere. We would just have a carbon-rich atmosphere. So it's really life that is maintaining and creating this chemical disequilibrium that allows life itself to keep going. And some space enthusiasts and engineers, they certainly think about, can we take a bunch of cyanobacteria or algae or microbes, extremophiles, and fling them onto another planet and like have them terraform, do what they did on Earth, right?
yeah,
And I suppose, theoretically, it's conceivable that something like that is possible. Like if there's sort of the correct inherent conditions to sustain those microbes or whatever they are, that and they're given enough time and opportunity, maybe they could, terraform the planet in a similar way. Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction writer, has some interesting thoughts about this. He writes in one of his novels, Aurora, that life is really an expression of its home planet. And that is part of why it's so difficult to take life from one planet to another and
mhm,
expect it to thrive there. The distances between living planets are so massive that, first of all, it's a huge challenge to get life from one planet to another, especially outside of one solar system. And then you throw this life into a completely alien environment and expect it to thrive or change the world, but it may not be capable of doing that. It may be that life has to emerge from its home planet and be an extension of that planet and change things from there. It's just not to say that it's impossible, just that it's an immense challenge, right?
mhm.
But and I think that's partly why, in my opinion, the kind of Elon Musk level fantasies of like doing this rapidly within our lifetimes, you just
Yeah.
don't make sense. It just doesn't align with what we know about our planet's ecology, because we're just nowhere near that sort of level of technological sophistication, even for a nearby planet like Mars. I think the best we could do in the near future would be something like a terrarium, which is so
Yeah.
different, from like actually terraforming the planet. So yeah, but it's fascinating to contemplate these ideas and questions in this context.
Yeah, I guess the closest we could get to is living in a bubble on Mars, but not actually living on Mars. Um, yeah, that
Yes.
makes sense. Yeah. Well, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Gaia hypothesis and how that plays into your book. I'm not sure if our listeners have heard of this, but this is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, the Gaia hypothesis was conceived by British scientist James Lovelock and then co-developed with an American biologist, Lynn Margulis, between the 1960s and 80s. So, people who were coming of age in that time period are often quite familiar with it because the Gaia hypothesis and Lovelock's initial books on them became such a cultural phenomenon, especially in the
Mhm.
late 70s and early 80s. And then, younger generations probably haven't heard of it nearly as much because it really kind of fell out of favor. And that's really an important part of this history is that, culturally, popularly, there was this great reception, but scientifically, there was a major backlash to Lovelock's initial articulations of the Gaia hypothesis. So, what he and Margulis proposed is that wherever life emerges, it inevitably transforms its home planet. That life is going to revolutionize the atmosphere, the continents, the oceans of any planet it emerges on. And that over time, life and the greater planetary environment, they form together a single self-regulating living system so that we can think of the Earth as a whole, as a giant living entity. That doesn't mean, it's a single organism in exactly the same way as a bacterium or a bird or a human. To me, it's more like a massive ecosystem. It's kind of like all of the other ecosystems braided together into this massive meta ecosystem that is a genuine, vast, interconnected living system. It has a certain capacity for self regulation, for resilience, and it has structures and rhythms and processes that resemble those of more familiar living entities like organisms and cells. So he was really trying to highlight, these incredible parallels between life at smaller scales and then at the planetary scale. And that did not initially sit well with a lot of evolutionary biologists, in particular,
Mhm.
like Richard Dawkins and his allies. They did not like the idea of a planet being alive because for them, they had already very strictly defined life as something that is made of cells, that reproduces, that competes, that is defined by evolution, by natural selection. And Earth doesn't really fit into that paradigm. It is not competing directly with other planets. It's not reproducing. As far as we know, it's not a direct product of natural selection. But because Earth is partly composed of life, and because life is an extension of the planet, and because life loops back to change the planet as a whole, it is bound up with the evolution of its constituent organisms. And you do see an evolution of the planet as a whole. It goes through these immense changes. And even when it is hit with these catastrophes, like the five great mass extinctions that Earth has endured, it every single time has rebounded. Every single time it has been able to recover and flourish. And yes, that takes a really long time, millions of years. But
Yeah.
we're talking about a planetary scale entity, right? So the rhythms and the timescales are very different from life on a microbial scale or a multicellular scale. And so over time, Lovelock and Margulis refined their ideas and they clarified that what they're talking about is, it doesn't require any teleology. It's not like organisms are deliberately cooperating for a specific goal. It's an emergent phenomenon. It is once
Mhm.
life emerges on a planet, it inevitably becomes entangled with that planet's geology, its chemistry, its meteorology, and you have these planetary scale phenomena and rhythms and evolution emerging from those inevitable interactions. And because of this scientific backlash and the stigma attached to Gaia, it's very much fallen out of favor in Western science, but kind of quietly, its core tenets became the foundations of a very much accepted mainstream field called Earth system science. And it's a
Mhm.
very young field compared to, geology or standard Earth science or chemistry or physics. But it's now universally accepted within science without any controversy whatsoever that life has been a major geophysical force that has profoundly transformed the planet, that Earth and life do change each other. There is this real coevolution between them, and that together life and Earth do form a single, highly interconnected system. And we can understand that system best, thinking of it as completely integrated, and not separating the geological from the biological, which has been kind of the prevailing tact, of Western science.
Well, I think even in college coursework, I mean, when I was in college, I always kind of was under the impression that, geology is on this other side of the field and you have biology over here and chemistry in the middle,
Hmm.
chemistry and physics somewhere in the middle. And what it sounds like is this is a very interdisciplinary field that's
Hmm.
bringing together these concepts. That's
Absolutely.
fascinating. That's fascinating. When you mentioned too this concept of Earth being able to rebound from these major shifts, and right now we live in a time of rapid climate change, and I think it's important to distinguish also that while the Earth may rebound after millions of years, not all species do. And so I don't know if you could elaborate a bit on that, and what does that mean in the human context when we think about Earth rebounding?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So Earth has this incredible innate resilience, this capacity to regulate its climate across massive geologic timescales that are very difficult for us to comprehend. And so we do see Earth, throughout its history, its 4.54 billion year history, oscillating between climatic extremes and being able to pull itself back when it does venture to those extreme hothouse states or deep freezes called snowball Earths. But in the process of recovery, as you say, the most of the species alive at the time go extinct because they cannot handle that kind of extreme climatic change, even when it's happening relatively gradually. And so what we have done is we have dramatically altered, our species has dramatically altered more parts of the planet faster than any other living species before us. And we've now thrown Earth into its most recent crisis state, and it is constantly trying to adjust, to restabilize.
Mhm.
And the symptoms of that are what we are seeing all the time. The extreme weather events, the wildfire crisis, the lethal heat waves, the intensifying hurricanes and storms. These are all symptoms of a hotter, wetter world that is trying to find a new equilibrium, a new balance. Um, and if we just all abandoned the planet or just stopped doing whatever we were doing, the Earth would gradually recover, but it would take a very, very long time to do this on its own. And that is why it is so important for us to, as self-aware beings, intervene, and not just leave this up to the planet's sort of self-correcting mechanisms, because that will take way too long, and we will not survive the process, and nor will the majority of complex life on this planet. Basically, it would recede to its most resilient forms of life, which tend to be things like extremophile microbes that can
Mhm.
handle, really extreme temperatures and conditions. Some types of photosynthetic life are really hardy as well, but humans, most mammals, a lot of reptiles and amphibians, all the amazing complex biodiversity, it can't handle that kind of extreme oscillation and sort of the ravages, that we're witnessing just the beginnings of right now. And so, that is why Earth system science underscores how important it is to address the major causes of global warming, which is, the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's like the fossil fuel industry and industrial agriculture. This is where a lot of the greenhouse gases are coming from. If we do not
Mhm.
reform those systems, and if we do not do so rapidly enough, then we are going to plunge the planet as a whole into a crisis state unlike anything we've ever experienced. Even our ancestors making their way through the ice ages wouldn't have dealt with this kind of rapid, catastrophic change.
Yeah, that I think it's the scale of time that's it's both difficult for us to comprehend because it's on such a the history of Earth is so vast, but the scale of speed at which we're seeing change is really incredible. Well, I want to talk about experimental stations. In the book, you write about a place called Pleistocene Park. What can you tell us about that, and what scientists there are trying to learn from these kind of experimental field stations?
Yeah, Pleistocene Park is a really fascinating place, and it was one of my favorites to visit during the reporting
Mhm,
process. It's an experimental nature park in remote Siberia, and it is managed by a team of scientists, the Zimovs and their family. They run this really important research station, and scientists from all over the world come to this research station to perform various kinds of Arctic ecology. In
mhm,
addition to that, they are running this experimental nature park that they've kind of cheekily named Pleistocene Park, kind of a winking reference to Jurassic Park, because what they're trying to do is to revive to some extent the kind of Pleistocene grasslands that ringed the northerly parts of the globe tens of thousands of years ago during the Stone Age or the Pleistocene. And to do that, they are trying to reintroduce large grazing animals like bison, Yakutian horses, camels, really hardy herbivores
mhm,
that can withstand the kind of extreme conditions they have there. And their theory is that the grazers and the grasses co-evolved and formed a very
mm,
powerful symbiosis so that they maintained each other. So that, the grasses and the grazers were dependent on each other. So the grazers would come through, they would trample the plants that would ordinarily compete with grasses like trees and shrubs, and they would fertilize the grasslands with their dung. And then the grasses would provide the grazers with just this endless sea of rapidly regenerating vegetation that the grazers could sustain themselves with. And in addition, these scientists, the Zimovs, believe that the grazers and grasses together were helping to keep the permafrost frozen and sort of counteract possible global warming. So the grazers can strip away layers of insulating snow just through their heft and through digging around, through tubers and
mhm,
more sources of food. And that allows the cold temperatures to penetrate deeper and keep the permafrost frozen. And then the permafrost contains massive amounts of carbon and methane that, if it thawed, would rise up into the atmosphere and dramatically accelerate global warming. So their idea is that, by involving this symbiosis, the grazers and grasses kept the permafrost frozen, counteracted global warming, and if they could recreate that, maybe they could keep the permafrost more frozen than it would otherwise be, because it is rapidly thawing as we speak, and that is, a massive potential danger towards accelerating climate change. um, yeah, and it's a really fascinating place. Even when you get to the main research station, you still have to travel several hours by boat just to get to the experimental nature park. It's a massive area of wilderness. There isn't a lot of native animal life there anymore, even though there used to be during the Pleistocene.
mhm,
But they have brought so many bison and horses and camels and yaks and other things, and you can see where they've started to change the landscape on a small scale, because normally it's very marshy. It's like this fetid marshland with a lot of just sort of sopping wet vegetation. But when the animals come in and they graze and then they help them plant by planting grasses, it turns into something much more like a grassland, and it becomes much drier. And you can see those stark differences. And so it was just really fascinating to see that in person. And it took like 3 days for me to get there from the west coast of North America. So
wow.
it was a really long journey, like just to arrive. And yeah, I had some really fascinating experiences there, and got to see a lot of Pleistocene age bones that are just being exposed on the riverbanks. As the river sort of
Wow.
washes away the cliff sides, these bones just come up to the surface. And so there's all these like ancient bison and cave lions and who knows what else, from tens of thousands of years ago, just sitting around.
Incredible. Well, and in your research for this book, what were some of the other, I guess, most interesting places that you visited? You went pretty deep
Mhm.
into the earth as well, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So in South Dakota, there was once a very active, a powerful gold mine, and the Homestake Gold Mine, and it has now been converted into a scientific laboratory. It's no longer active as a mine anymore, but you
Mhm.
can still descend close to a mile beneath the surface of the planet through this
Wow.
mine's elevator shaft and its tunnels. And so scientists go there, and most of the scientists that go there are physicists, actually, and they're conducting these very delicate experiments that have to be shielded from cosmic rays. So they use that mile of rock around them as a massive shield to protect their experimental equipment. But I went with a team of microbiologists, and in particular, geomicrobiologists. So
Mhm.
they study how microbes are interconnected with the planet's geological processes, and they go down into this mine and they hunt for these really bizarre microbes that live in the planet's deep crust and are constantly changing its mineral structure. And so they're particularly interested in these areas of the mine where miners have accidentally tapped into all of this underground water. Because, the planet's crust, contrary to what we used to think a few decades ago, is actually full of water. Some scientists think it may contain more water than all of the oceans on the surface if we like
Wow.
added it all up. And most of it is trapped in these like small fissures and pores, so it's under a lot of
Mhm.
pressure. So sometimes when miners tap into it, it explodes out of the rock. So usually what they will do is plug that up because otherwise it would flood their tunnels. But
Yeah,
these
yeah.
but the biologists come in, they're like, wait, no, like, can you let us put like a tap on this so we can like sample the water and like see what's living inside it and take it back to our labs? So they go to these areas where they've basically got, microbes on tap, and they'll sample it and take it back and study it. And they have found that all of this water is indeed full of living microbes. And these microbes are very different from surface microbes. So they typically don't have access to oxygen or light. So they can't do photosynthesis and they can't breathe, they can't respire oxygen in many cases. So they've evolved other ways to get energy.
Mhm.
They literally eat or breathe rock. They're using
Wow.
metal and rock as their final electron acceptors, in the process of respiration. And they'll do really weird things with minerals too. Like they'll take rock and minerals into their cells, more, change them around and then expel new byproducts. So some of them will excrete like little iron corkscrew spiral type things, and others will sort of trap sulfur in their cells and things like that. And then another place I visited that I think we would both love and sort of appreciate is the
Mhm.
heart of the Amazon rainforest.
Oh, yeah.
And there's this amazing research station there called the Amazon Tall Tower Observatory. It's exactly what it sounds like.
Mhm.
It's actually a collection of massive towers, but the tallest one is more than 1,000 feet tall, and it's the tallest structure in all of South America. And it functions as a scientific observatory that's literally halfway between the trees and the clouds, and it's studded with scientific equipment that collects gases and particles from the atmosphere. So scientists from all over visit and they study the relationship between the forest and the atmosphere and the soil and the water cycle and how all of those things are interconnected. And I went with scientists who are particularly interested in that water cycle I mentioned earlier and how, the rainforest is generating so much of its rain. And so to get up this tower, whereas in the mine, there's an elevator that takes you right down to the bottom within 10 minutes. There's no elevator on this tower. So you have to
Oh, boy.
climb, you have to climb all the way up yourself. So, and it's kind of intimidating because it's not really wrapped in a sort of protective barrier the way that like the Eiffel Tower would be or a tourist attraction. It's
Yeah.
more like the sort of scaffolding you would climb to get to like a utility line or like an electricity line or
Wow.
something. So you have to be harnessed to the railing just in case you slip through one of the massive gaps that are everywhere, between the steps. So you're like climbing this massive staircase and like a bare bones scaffolding just to get to the top of this thing, which is like physically taxing and emotionally draining. And they're very concerned that anybody would be like afraid of heights or like not able to physically complete the climb. So they're always asking you like, before we start, like, are you sure that you can
You
do this?
sure?
And then they ask you so many times that you start to doubt yourself. You're like, well,
Yeah.
maybe I don't know if I can do this. But I went with scientists who have done this a million times. So I drew a lot of courage from them. And it was actually really exciting because, you step up through the layers of the forest and then you get
Mhm.
so high above it and you just see it in a way you've never experienced before. Even if you look
Wow.
out an airplane window, it's just a glimpse, and it's
Mhm.
like, but it's so different to be able to stand there and take your time and really understand the rainforest as this massive living network that stretches farther than you can see. I mean, the Amazon basically, stretches across an entire continent. It's a massive area. There's no way you could
Mhm.
ever see that whole thing all at once except from space. And so to be able to see that from this, vantage point is just really cool. And then you can see the moisture rising off of the forest, the clouds
Wow.
forming above you, and you understand the connections between them. And then you have to book it down before the torrents unleash and the thunder starts and the lightning strikes the
So this
tower
is like
because it's actually
a metal tower that I
yes.
think, I think I'll stay below with the plants. It's
It's
like
yeah, it's a little bit dangerous in the midst of a thunderstorm, so you have to get back down there. Yeah, and then the forest itself, as you know, it's just endlessly fascinating. Like just the plants
Yeah,
on the plants on the plants, and then the life on the life on the
incredible.
life, and like every inch is just covered in life. So it's just so inspiring.
Oh, that sounds beautiful. I mean, I think this is like something that comes across in your book is the layers of life and this engagement between what, we consider to, the inanimate parts of Earth, but
Mhm,
actually how biology shapes this. And, on the show, we talk a lot about the human body as an ecosystem, and in particular our gut microbiome and how that relates to our immune health, how that relates to our, kind of the gut brain axis and those communication systems. And as I was reading your book, I also kind of found some of those parallels, right? The microbiome of
mhm,
Earth is such an integral part of what Earth is today and where it's
mhm,
going. Um, so you mentioned these organisms that are way deep into the Earth's crust. Um, did you find in your research that microbes are kind of at every layer of Earth? I'm assuming they're doing different things. Like,
mhm,
how important are microbes? A lot of people get really icked out about germs or about, microbial life thinking, just bad things, but actually life isn't possible
mhm,
without these,
mhm.
right? Like, what can you share about
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. Yeah, I think that analogy is a really powerful one. Earth does have a microbiome, just as we do. We now
Mhm,
understand that all multicellular complex organisms are covered in and filled with microbes. Everything from humans to trees to mammals, all of us, we have these incredible microbial societies living all over and within us. And that is very true of Earth as well. And in fact, that was probably the first kind of life to emerge, was these incredible
mhm,
microbial societies. Then they're really responsible for the most fundamental and profound transformations. They're the ones that initiated the oxygenation of the atmosphere. They're the ones that shifted the sky to its blue hue. They're the ones that kick-started the process of turning barren crust into fertile soil. They define the chemistry of the ocean. So as you said, they're literally in every layer of the planet. Everywhere that we've been able to access, we have found microbes. And that goes from miles below the surface to even the clouds above us that we used to think were sterile, that nothing could survive up there. We now know that microbes are routinely whisked from the surface into the sky in clouds. And not only are they changing the weather, but some microbes can live in the clouds for weeks or months at a time, even eating cloud molecules and potentially even reproducing up there before they return to the surface in rain and snow and hail. So they really are everywhere, and they're really changing things all the time and really defining the planet as a whole. And yeah, it's really, I really don't think Earth would function as we understand
mhm.
it without these microbes. And I think that's very true for our bodies and for all complex life as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about our fascination going back to the idea of Pleistocene Park or Jurassic Park and our fascination with megafauna, it's really, I mean, megafauna, of course, are really cool, and it's amazing to find these bones of, fossils of dinosaurs, but I think it'd be really cool to see, maybe a film on the microfauna. Is
Hmm.
it, something that really gets into the role that microbes have had. That's great. Well, I guess we're getting close to the end of the show, and I wanted to ask this last question is, when you after you've written this book, and I know that you are really a plant person and love nature, I'm wondering how all this new information that you've garnered through this process, how has this affected, the way that you live? Yeah.
Yeah, as I was writing this book, gardening organically became a very important part of my life. And it also became a way in which I was most personally and directly engaging with this science and this material. Although I've loved gardening from a young age, I didn't really have the opportunity to have a large garden of my own until very recently, like just a few years ago, actually, when my partner and I bought a house, our first house for the first time here in Portland. And part of the reason we were attracted to this property was that it had a really unusually large and deep south facing lot. And it was
Mhm.
simply covered in grass. So it was a blank canvas for us. And we knew that we could take all that out and make a garden from scratch, which to us was a very exciting project. But I quickly discovered that our soil was in really bad shape. And I did some research on the history of this area. And it turned out that our lot had been a construction site. And then before that, a parking lot for a long time. And then they had kind of just thrown this frock of turf grass over it to kind of disguise all of this neglect.
Mm.
So the soil, in addition to being really clay heavy, like a lot of soil is here in Portland, it's full of rubble and gravel and debris, and it's completely depleted of nutrients, particularly nitrogen, which is particularly important for plants.
Mhm.
And so I had to rapidly learn about soil science and like what to do about this situation. Because in the past, I just got in a couple of bags of good soil from the nursery and filled up some pots or a small
Yeah.
raised bed. Like, wasn't a big deal. I can't do that. Like, that wasn't
With a whole
financially.
yard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that wasn't gonna work. So I had to like, what do I actually do about this? And I realized that I really had been thinking about soil incorrectly, because I thought of it as like this repository of nutrients that you could kind of just deplete and replenish over and over again. But I've now come to see soil as itself a living network, a living entity. It's really all about the interrelationships between, the rock, the water, and the air, and then all of the life that is continually transforming that rock, water, and air. And it's only when all of those things work together that we get what we understand as soil, at least the kind of fertile soil we rely on to grow crops. It's very different from like what you might call like paleosols on like Mars or something. That's, yeah, you could technically call that soil, but it's not soil as we understand it here on Earth.
Yeah.
So now my task was to bring all of that soil back to life. And I found that the answer was plants, to be honest.
Mhm.
If you bring in a large number of healthy, diverse plants, you allow their roots to permeate that soil.
Mhm.
They become havens for all of their symbiotic microbes and fungi. They facilitate the development of really good soil architecture. And then they provide this protective cloak of vegetation that protects soil from the elements. And that's soil is so vulnerable to that kind of destruction. Like, that's what we saw in the Dust Bowl when we just stripped everything away, and then all,
Mhm.
the rain and the weather and the wind completely turned all of that once beautiful soil into dust. So if you provide that protection and those symbiotic partners, you can completely transform the soil. And although that does take time, I am astonished by what plants can do and their partners if you give them enough space and opportunity. We put them out there as babies, and within a couple years, they grew so much and completely transformed the whole environment. And we've documented that, and we share that with our family and friends, and people are astonished by that transformation. But for me, it's like the plants and the fungi and the microbes, they did most of the work. Like, we kind
Mhm.
of set the conditions up for them and put them there. And then they really did most of the work. I think they really deserve, the real credit. And I think anybody can do this on whatever scale is available to you. And, we've now witnessed so much wildlife come to our garden where before there was nothing. There was no
Yeah.
reason for wildlife to visit before. But now we have dragonflies, butterflies, grasshoppers, birds, all kinds of insects and arthropods, and even small mammals like jumping mice, and even a family of raccoons that likes to come and take a dip in the pond we made. So it's just,
That's
it's
great.
very, it's much more of an ecosystem than it was before. It's storing a lot more carbon, and we're growing food for ourselves as well. We've been harvesting so many tomatoes and corn and herbs and all kinds of stuff this year. So it just makes me really happy to be able to steward this tiny part of our living Earth. I can at least have some influence over this because I know that climate change can feel so overwhelming, understandably.
Yeah.
But we can all make a difference, in our homes, in our communities, on whatever scales are, available and feasible to us locally.
No, I love that sentiment, and I mean, I think you're right. We had, Doug Tallamy on the show, earlier this season, and he echoed those thoughts of really, like, there's a lot that you can do on a small scale with native plants, with
Mhm.
really supporting your pollinators and, creating an environment that's friendly, creating an ecosystem in your yard with very simple steps. So, I love that. Maybe is there gonna be a gardening book up next for you? Because I think you've got some
Yeah.
good material there.
I would love to do a gardening book at some point. And I also have this dream of like illustrating something I write one day. I've been
Oh,
like trying to
yeah.
get better at watercolor and things like that. I think that could be a really good medium for a subject for that as well.
Absolutely, the evolution of a garden. Wow.
Mhm.
Well, in the meantime, while we await that next work, I wanna remind the audience, Ferris's book, Becoming Earth, is out now. You can find it in bookstores all over. You can find it online. You can also go to his website. Your website is just your name, right? FerrisGaabr.com. Anything else they should know? Do you have anything coming up?
I just gave my first TED Talk, and that video should go online at
Exciting.
some point. And I'm going to be part of the Portland Book Festival here in November, and then part of the
Mhm.
Tucson Book Festival in March in Arizona. And I list all my events on my website as well, so that's probably the best place to find them and keep up to date. And next year, hopefully, we'll have the paperback version coming out as well. So it'll be a little smaller, a little
Fantastic.
more manageable, a little more affordable.
No, well, it's fantastic. It's a great read, so make sure you guys go out and get it. Again, Becoming Earth: How Our Planet Came to Life, and really how our planet is alive. I think that's what's great about this. Well, thanks so much, Ferris, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Yeah. All right, you've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. You can find this and all of our other episodes at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also head over to the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel to find the video version of this episode. I want to give a shout out of thanks to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for putting on a great show every week. And thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Stay healthy out there, and we'll see you next time.